What happens when two legends collide? Boris Spassky and Mikhail Tal at the Montreal International in 1979. We know Tal, a very aggressive attacking player. Spassky was sort of a universal all-around player, and historically Tal had a fairly difficult time with Spassky. But as time went on, Tal began to do fairly well against him, and this is a very interesting game. Spassky with white, Tal with black. Will Mikhail Tal get one of his classic attacking games here? Let's jump right in and find out. Spassky begins with d4. Tal plays knight to f6, c4, and e6. This is a move that can go a lot of different ways. If white plays knight to c3, then you have the Nimzo-Indian defense, for example. Knight to f3 was played instead by Spassky, and here black has a lot of choices. You can play into the Queen's Gambit with d5. You can play the Benoni with c5. Tal plays b6, or the Queen's Indian defense. And the idea here, just as in the Nimzo-Indian, is black wants to establish control over the e4 square. So he fine kiddos on the queen's side so the bishop can establish some influence on e4. e3 from Spassky, a sort of a simple system, not too aggressive. Bishop to b7, playing to control that critical e4 square. Bishop to d3, white wants his share of that square. d5. So at first glance, it looks like Tal is blocking in the bishop at b7, and he is, but this bishop can be opened up later if Tal takes on c4 with the d-pawn, and even if he doesn't, this bishop still has a lot of latent power along this light square diagonal that white has to always be worried about. b3, we see Spassky sort of imitating Tal, and they're developing in a very similar way. Bishop to d6, both sides castles. Bishop to b2, knight b to d7, and knight b to d2. So the positions are identical, with the only difference being that white has played c2, c4, and black has not yet committed his c-pawn. Here Tal plays queen to e7. One of the ideas behind this move is, in order for black to get his fair share of the center, at some point he will either need to play c5 or e5. And with the queen on e7, it supports both of those pawn pushes. He may be able to take on c4 and then push e5, for example, and the queen would support that move. Rook to c1 from Spassky, preparing perhaps for this c-file to open up. Rook a to d8, just centralizing his rook, temporarily placing it opposite the queen. I know that file is very congested at the moment, but it can still open up and cause some trouble for white later. But queen to c2 is played by Spassky. Again, building up on the c-file, but also establishing firm control over e4. So if Tal wanted to, say, play, knight e4, f5, and attack on the king side, this move makes that idea much more difficult. So Tal plays c5. So the pawn structure is symmetrical, as we can see. Both sides have this same type of structure. But there's a great deal of tension here in the center. A lot of potential pawn exchanges can take place and a lot of dynamic possibilities. But Spassky is the first to establish the structure. He plays cd5. Tal responds by taking with the pawn. And then Spassky takes on c5, and Tal responds by taking with the b-pawn. So what we have here, these pawns at c5 and d5, are known as the hanging pawns. They're a similar, or sort of a brother-sister relationship, I guess you could say, with the isolated queen's pawn. Basically, what white wants to do is fix these pawns in place, attack them, and maybe get one of them to advance and weaken the opposite square. So if he plays b4 at some point and this pawn advances, it would weaken the dark squares. If b-pawn is played and this pawn advances, it weakens c4. Basically, white wants to fix these pawns and treat them as a target. But it's not all bad for black. The truth is, he controls a lot of central space with these four pawns. And at some point, he could even advance the pawns for an attack. And we even saw a game on this channel at one point where Fischer used these hanging pawns and played c4 and used his c-pawn as an attacking weapon on the queen's side. And here, Spassky tempts Tal. He plays queen to c3. Now, this move is directed against the move knight to e4, because if he plays knight to e4, Spassky would just take on g7, and it would be checkmate. But the queen is in a bit of a precarious spot on c3. And he is inviting Tal to play d4 and open up this long diagonal for his bishop, even at the cost of a pawn. But we know Tal, he would never worry about sacrificing a pawn. So this is a very provocative move from Spassky. Rook f to e8. Tal continues to centralize his pieces. Rook f to d1. Spassky says, I'm not worried about my queen. And Tal says, okay. And boom, he plays d4, opening up this long diagonal for his light squared bishop. And also, you notice his dark squared bishop is also on a nice diagonal. So Tal's pieces are in a pretty good position to attack the king side. Spassky takes on d4, Tal retakes, and the best move here looks to be knight takes d4. That's the computer recommendation. But we can understand why a human being would not want to play this move against Tal, because that actually further opens up these diagonals, and now even h2 isn't even covered by a knight. And that's a little bit scary. Turns out a computer can defend this, but a human being just doesn't want to do this. The second best move was probably queen takes d4, but then after knight to c5, black is threatening to get the key light squared bishop. He's also threatening bishop h2 check, followed by rook takes queen. So because of all of that, Spassky plays the move queen to a5, but that looks to be a little too slow. And also, there are two problems with it. First of all, it leaves the pawn here. So Tal still has that pawn, and this pawn controls some very key squares. But also, we'll find that this queen is not well placed, and Tal finds a perfect way to exploit its presence on the a5 square. First, he plays knight to e5, threatening or offering the exchange of knights and also hitting this bishop at d3. So knight takes e5. And of course, Tal is not going to retake with the queen, because then the queens would be exchanged, and this is perfectly fine for white. He wants to keep queens on and keep up the pressure, so he takes with the bishop. Here, knight to c4 is played by Spassky, putting pressure on that bishop. And the problem with knight to f3 is that Tal could just chop it off, and now these pawns are a wreck around Spassky's king, and after a move like knight to d5, the queen is coming in, the knight is coming in, and he's in terrible shape. So to avoid that, he plays the knight to c4. He wants to put pressure on this bishop. And it turns out bishop takes h2 check actually would have worked here, but the move that Tal plays is it's a much more natural move and very powerful still. He plays the move rook to d5. What he is doing, of course, he's hitting this queen at a5, so he gains a tempo, but he's also playing a rook lift, preparing for that rook to shift over to the king side and attack white's king. This rook lift is going to be quite powerful. Queen to d2 from Spassky, and now, boom, bishop takes h2 check. A move like, say, king to f1 does not really work. The rook can just go to h5, and Tal is threatening bishop f4, hitting the queen, followed by rook to h1, which would be mate. So, for example, if rook to e1, he could just play bishop to f4, attacking the queen and threatening mate. And even if rook takes queen, he can just retake with the rook, because the threats are too great. If queen takes bishop, rook to h1 is checkmate, because you see this rook controls the file, so the king can't move over there. And if instead, say, king to g1, then just bishop takes d2, and he's up material and has a better position. The knight's threatening to come into f4, where it will attack g2 along with this bishop. And so basically, Spassky has to take that bishop at h2, the offered piece. King takes h2 check, but now because of the rook lift, he doesn't play knight to g4, but he plays, boom, rook to h5 check, king to g1, and knight to g4. And believe it or not, in this position, Spassky resigned because of the threat of rook to h1 check is so great. The idea is rook to h1 check, king takes, then queen to h4, and it's an eventual mate. So, for example, let's just do a null move here. Let's rook to h1 check, king takes, queen to h4 check, and mate. The only realistic defensive idea for white here would be to play queen to f4, because that queen covers the h2 square and would stop the mate, because black would not have the check there. But in that case, black just plays queen to h4 directly. And now there would be nothing that Spassky could do to prevent checkmate. So the game, really a brilliant attacking game from Mikhail Tal against a world-class opponent who tempted him a little bit too much. And Tal used those hanging pawns as an attacking unit and really destroyed the great Spassky's king. I hope you've enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.